It was inevitable, I suppose, so presented here is a brief overview of my home studio where I repair, update, test, learn, and yes, on occasion, play, record, and compose on a small set of 80s and 90s synthesizers. It's always in transition, so this is what's in the collection as of April 2020. So let's get started. The room is about 21 by 10.5 feet with 8-foot high ceilings, and I've recently begun to treat the space with strategically placed diffusion and absorption materials, including home furnishings and wood and foam panels. It's a work in progress. This is one of two dry erase films I use for to-do lists, setup charts, and massive track sheets for recording. Some SKB rack cases with MIDI gear and sound equipment, and my makeshift workbench for repairs. We'll explore the workbench here in just a little bit. Panning back, you'll see a couple of keyboards that I'll return to shortly, but let's start in earnest on the far side of the rabbit hole. I've only tested and cleaned this Yamaha MD4S mini disc 4-track, but this Tascam 688 8-track cassette has had belts replaced and the transport calibrated so far. Dozens of new wrapped cassettes from 1986 through 89 are waiting for use in the 688. But both multitracks have unique features that evolved from their respective eras, one digital, one analog, but both powerful machines. And of course, the back wall needed some acoustic treatment as well, and it's all held in place with 2-inch T-pins, which are easily removed to alter the panel configuration. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll recognize the formidable Roland MC80, which is a great hardware sequencer for DAW-less MIDI recording. The green screen will need replacing soon, but otherwise everything works flawlessly, including the internal hard drive and floppy disk drive. Underneath, I have the PV Spectrum Synth and a Roland JV1080, just below the Akai S900 sampler with upgraded media storage and a new bright, sharp display. The next rack over, we have an Apogee Mini-Me mic pre and the Presonus Audio Box 96 for interfacing with the Mac that runs Logic Pro. Two JL Cooper Synapses are there for MIDI routing. Climbing skyward, we find the EMU Morpheus and Ultra Proteus sitting beneath the Alesis S4 and Motu MIDI Express patch bay. Climbing up the rack are the JV880, Wavestation SR, and one of my favorites, the TG500 by Yamaha. Sitting on top of the rack case is the home of the Roland Human Rhythm Composer, a classic late 80s drum machine with deep possibilities for programming feel and groove into a drum box pattern. The next rack over has the midsection dedicated to audio routing. On the Furman power conditioner sits a Radial Engineering Stereo DI box, and there's also an Ensoniq DP4 quad effects processor just above. All audio gets run through the Mackie LM3204 mixer for playback and recording, and to make this less of a hassle, two Samson 1/4-inch patch bays are used regularly. And finally, the top of the rack stack here has an R8M percussion module, which is the R8 without drum pattern functions. There's also a JD990, an Ensoniq MR rack, Novation Super Bass Station, JV2080, and an OB Matrix 1000, all with space between the units for heat dissipation. And for both their own voices and to trigger other synth modules in the rig, I primarily use a Yamaha YS200 FM keyboard and the unique and often moody Kawai K3 with its analog filters on top of wavetable shapes. The K3 has those funky 80s membrane buttons, which I do not love, but it's a very cool synth overall. Now, I'm a huge fan of the HS8 monitors by Yamaha, and I'm just now getting to treating the space near and around them to play nicely with all the drywall in my room. These are affordable and extremely reliable. And in the back here are my cable stacks. Every kind of connection you could imagine sits back here just in case it's needed for new additions or alternate setups. I've got HOSA, Seismic, off-brand Amazon throwaways in MIDI DINs, 1/4-inch TS and TRS, XLR, RCA, singles, snakes, yada 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 yada. This is some test gear on the bench, including tools and cleaners and parts. And let's not forget blue painter's tape, always handy. And a recent purchase of a TC Electronic Clarity M for graphically viewing the audio. Huge fan of meters and Southwest designs. Heavy, thick curtains, in addition to foam absorbers, help tame the room. I like to use housewares and furniture in the studio when possible since it's less expensive and makes the vibe more comfortable with a homey feel. But there's always more analysis and treatment to be done. Scanning back across the room is a collection of, among other things, video support gear for filming this content, a bit disorganized. When not in use, I roll a small stand with a voiceover mic behind the listening couch so it's out of the way. And the listening area has a Windows PC, which is useful for vintage OS and sound file conversions, and a strange looking mix of sound panels I'm currently experimenting with. Notice the push pins holding them in place for the moment. This area is also out of the way enough to keep RAM and ROM synth cards, floppies, tapes, optical discs, and various other media stored in wooden cigar boxes for no particularly good reason other than they need to be put somewhere. And this is my favorite book on music production. It's by George Martin. I got it in the 80s, and it's been invaluable over the decades. Off to the side here are some floppies that need to be converted for use on the USB reader I recently installed in the S900 sampler, so that's on the to-do list. And here you can see I've taped the original room acoustic test results to the board, but now that the walls have been treated, I need to remeasure the acoustics. Over here is the shorthand indication of where all the synth gear audio is connected in the Samson patch bays, and of course there's plenty of space left on the board for notes and ideas. So here's just a quick look at the organized spaghetti behind just one rack set. There actually is a method to all of this, and I know exactly where everything comes from and goes to in the system. I try to use snaked cabling when possible, but it isn't always feasible, so there's no digital optical convenience with old analog synthesizers and mixers. Wired quarter-inch TS connections for audio and 5-pin DIN cabling for MIDI data communication is pretty much the standard here. The 80s and 90s were just a mess of wires for those decades. Cable management saves headaches when troubleshooting. Well, there you have it, a brief tour. There's plenty of gear to learn, play, maybe repair or update if needed, and certainly enough to make more videos about. Let me know if you have a specific interest in any of these pieces to add to the to-do list on the big white board. I've tried to build a setup that has a variety of manufacturers incorporating different clever synthesis innovations, but much of what I have here represents the transition away from pure analog by diving into Rompler-style synthesis and digital processing. Surely you notice that companies like Roland and Yamaha and Ensoniq are heavily represented here. Other companies from the era like Digitech, Fostex, and Sequential have yet to make an appearance here in my collection, but my list of hunted gear is lengthy on both Reverb and eBay, so perhaps it's just a matter of time and money. And sure, most of this can be emulated in software on a laptop now, but no virtual emulation can provide my favorite thing about hardware gear, the atmosphere when the lights are low. Silly perhaps, but the mood cannot be ignored. And that's theoretically why I put up with all the cabling frustration and high electric bills. Well, that's the story I'm going with for the moment. Hope you enjoyed the tour, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below.